Some creatures don't knock because they expect help, they knock because they have nowhere else left to go. The sound was so faint Ethan Cole almost mistook it for the wind brushing against the cabin walls, the kind of hollow whisper that slipped through the pine trees and settled into the cracks of old wood, but then it came again, a soft scrape, uneven, dragging, like something fragile refusing to give up, and Ethan, who had long ago trained himself to ignore the world's quieter pleas, slowly lifted his head from the dim glow of the fireplace where embers pulsed low and tired, his cabin sitting deep in the Montana woods miles from the nearest town, where silence wasn't just normal, it was expected, and anything that broke it usually meant trouble or memory, both of which he had spent years avoiding, yet something about that sound lingered in the air, thin but stubborn, and before he could convince himself to stay seated, his boots were already moving across the creaking floor, each step measured, cautious, like a man who had learned that even the smallest disturbance could carry consequences, his hand pausing on the cold iron handle before he pulled the door open just enough to let the night spill in, the air biting at his face, sharp and clean, carrying the scent of snow and pine and something else, something faintly metallic and tired, and that was when he saw her, barely visible against the dark ground, a German shepherd collapsed just inches from his doorstep, her body pressed low as if the earth itself was the only thing holding her together, her fur matted with dirt and frost, sides rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths that seemed to struggle against the weight of the cold, but it wasn't her condition that held him there, frozen in place, it was her eyes, amber but dimmed, still open, still searching, fixed not on him exactly but on something beyond him, something deeper in the woods as if she had not yet finished what she came to do, and for a long second neither of them moved, the wind weaving softly through the trees, the world holding its breath between them, until she shifted just slightly, her paw scraping against the wooden step in a motion so weak it barely made a sound, yet it carried a message louder than anything Ethan had heard in years, and something inside him, something he had buried beneath routine and silence and long, empty nights, stirred in a way he didn't recognize anymore, because he had seen that look before, not in a dog, but in people, in moments when time was running out and words no longer mattered, only intent, only direction, only the quiet, desperate hope that someone would understand, and Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him heavier than it should have, his jaw tightening as he crouched down despite himself, the cold seeping through his jeans as he lowered to her level, his hand hovering just above her shoulder, not touching yet, as if waiting for permission, and when his fingers finally brushed against her fur, she didn't flinch, didn't resist, she simply let out a breath so soft it almost disappeared into the night. And then, with what little strength she had left, her gaze shifted again toward the dark line of trees beyond the clearing, holding there, steady, unwavering, as if pointing him somewhere he had no intention of going, and Ethan felt it then, the quiet weight of a choice he hadn't planned to make, one that didn't belong to his past or his solitude or the careful walls he had built around both, but to something else entirely, something that had arrived on his doorstep uninvited and undeniable, and for the first time in a long while, the silence around him didn't feel empty, it felt like it was waiting. The cold followed them inside as Ethan lifted her, the weight of her body lighter than he expected, as if the miles she had traveled had already taken most of what she had to give, and yet there was still something in the way she held herself, a quiet resistance, a refusal to completely let go, her breath brushing faintly against his wrist as he carried her toward the fire, the door closing behind them with a dull thud that sealed out the night but not the feeling it had brought with it, and for a moment he simply stood there, unsure of what to do next, because this was not part of the life he had built, not part of the silence he had chosen, but the dog did not give him time to hesitate, her body tensing just slightly in his arms before her head turned again toward the door, toward the same unseen point beyond the cabin walls, and Ethan felt it again, that quiet insistence, not urgent in sound but impossible to ignore, so he set her gently down on the old wool blanket near the fireplace, the fabric worn thin from years of use, and knelt beside her, his hands moving with a kind of practiced care he had not used in a long time, checking her breathing, brushing frost from her coat, pouring a small amount of water into a metal bowl and nudging it close to her muzzle, but she barely responded, her tongue moving only slightly before she stilled again, her energy spent not on survival but on something else, something he could not yet see, and Ethan leaned back on his heels, exhaling slowly as the fire crackled beside them, the light casting long shadows that stretched across the cabin floor like silent witnesses, and he tried to reason with himself, telling himself that whatever had brought her here was not his responsibility, that animals wandered, that sometimes they did not make it, that he had already done enough by bringing her inside, but the thought did not settle, it lingered uneasily, because deep down he knew this was not random, not just a creature collapsing at the wrong doorstep, there had been direction in her movement, purpose in the way she had chosen this place, this cabin, him, and that realization sat heavier than the cold ever could, and as if to confirm it, the dog stirred again, a faint whine escaping her throat, barely audible but carrying a thread of urgency that cut through the quiet, her paw shifting weakly against the blanket before lifting just an inch and falling again, the motion incomplete yet unmistakable, reaching, asking, and Ethan followed her gaze this time without hesitation, looking toward the dark window where the forest pressed close against the glass, branches swaying slowly in the night wind, shadows moving like something alive, and he felt a flicker of something he had not allowed himself in years, not fear, not quite, but recognition, the kind that came when instinct spoke louder than logic, and he stood, moving toward the door again, his hand pausing briefly on the latch as he glanced back at her, her eyes still open, still fixed, waiting, and in that moment it became clear to him that whatever had started out there had not ended here, this was only the beginning of it, and he let out a quiet breath. The kind a man releases when he knows he is about to step back into something he once swore he had left behind, pulling on his heavy coat from the hook by the door, grabbing the old flashlight that sat beside it, its beam flickering once before steadying as if it too had been waiting for a reason to be used again, and when he opened the door a second time, the night felt different, no longer empty, no longer silent, but filled with something unseen, something calling just beyond the reach of light, and behind him, on the worn blanket by the fire. The dog finally closed her eyes for a brief moment, not in surrender, but in trust, as if she knew the message had been understood. The beam of Ethan's flashlight cut a narrow path through the darkness as he stepped off the cabin porch and into the snow, each foot sinking a few inches with a soft crunch that echoed louder than it should have in the stillness, the forest ahead stretching wide and patient as if it had been waiting for him to return, and for a moment he paused, scanning the tree line, his breath visible in the cold air, rising and fading like a signal with no one to answer, but then he noticed it, faint at first, almost invisible against the uneven ground, a line of disturbed snow weaving between the trees, not fresh, not clean, but broken in a way that told a quiet story of struggle, shallow impressions, uneven spacing, the kind left behind by something that had been moving slowly, painfully, determined not by strength but by purpose, and Ethan lowered the beam closer, crouching slightly as he followed the trail with his eyes, recognizing the pattern immediately, a dog, but not just any movement. This was the path of something that had been carrying more than its body could handle, stopping often, shifting direction, yet always continuing forward, and something tightened in his chest as he realized just how far she must have come, how many hours, maybe days, it had taken for her to reach his door, and more importantly, what she had left behind to do it, the thought settling into him with a weight he could not ignore, and without another second of hesitation he stepped forward, following the trail into the trees, the branches overhead creaking softly as the wind moved through them, a low murmur that seemed to guide him deeper, the beam of light swaying with each step, catching glimpses of bark, frost, and shadow, the world narrowing down to a single line of movement that pulled him forward like an invisible thread, and as he walked, something unfamiliar began to surface, not urgency, not panic, but a quiet awareness, the kind he used to feel when every sense had to be sharper than the last, when the smallest detail could change everything, and he realized he was listening again, truly listening, to the forest, to the rhythm of his own steps, to the subtle shifts in the air that hinted at something just out of sight, and then the trail changed, the impressions in the snow growing closer together, deeper in some places, as if the dog had struggled more here, the ground dipping slightly into a shallow clearing surrounded by fallen branches and an old, hollowed tree that leaned at an angle, its trunk split open just enough to reveal darkness inside, and Ethan slowed, his breath catching slightly as the beam of his flashlight settled on the base of the tree, where the snow had been disturbed more heavily, paw prints overlapping, circling, stopping, and that was when he heard it, so faint he almost missed it, a soft, uneven sound, not quite a whimper, not quite a cry, but something in between, fragile and searching, and he moved closer, lowering himself to one knee as he angled the light into the hollow, the darkness inside giving way slowly, revealing shapes that shifted and trembled against one another, small bodies pressed together for warmth, their fur barely formed, their movements weak but persistent, and Ethan felt something inside him give way, something he had kept locked behind years of silence and distance, because this was not chance, this was not a random path through the woods, this was a message carried through exhaustion and pain, a final act of will from a creature that had chosen him for a reason he was only now beginning to understand, and as he reached his hand carefully into the hollow, one of the small forms stirred, nudging weakly against his fingers, seeking warmth, seeking life, and Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound steady but heavy. As the truth settled fully into place, she had not come to his cabin to be saved, she had come so that they could be found, and in that moment, standing alone in the cold forest with the quiet weight of new lives resting in his hands, Ethan realized that the night had not brought him back into the world by accident, it had brought him back because something, somewhere, believed he still belonged in it. The cold seemed sharper on the way back, or perhaps it was the weight in Ethan's arms that made every step more deliberate, each small body he carried wrapped carefully inside his coat, their faint warmth pressing against him in fragile pulses that reminded him how thin the line between survival and silence could be, and he moved steadily through the trees, the beam of his flashlight now lowered, no longer searching but guiding, the path behind him already beginning to soften under fresh flakes. Drifting quietly from the sky, as if the forest itself was erasing the struggle that had taken place there, leaving only the outcome behind, and for the first time in a long while Ethan did not resist the feeling that followed him, not the memory, not the weight, but something quieter, something steadier, a sense that this night had shifted something inside him that could not be undone. And when the outline of the cabin finally appeared through the trees, dim and familiar, he felt a subtle urgency return, not the sharp kind that once defined his past, but something gentler, something rooted in care rather than command, and he pushed the door open with his shoulder, stepping quickly inside where the fire still glowed, its warmth spilling across the room like a quiet welcome, and he moved immediately to the blanket near the hearth, kneeling as he carefully opened his coat, revealing the small, trembling forms nestled within, their movements weak but alive, each breath a quiet promise that had nearly been lost, and he placed them gently onto the wool, adjusting the folds to hold the heat, his hands moving with a precision that came not from thought but from instinct long buried, long denied, and only when they were settled did he look up, his gaze finding the place where he had left her, and for a brief moment the world seemed to still. Because she had not moved, her body resting exactly as it had been, yet something had changed, something so subtle it could only be felt, not seen, a stillness that carried a different kind of silence, one that did not ask or reach or hold on, but simply remained, and Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound quiet but heavy as he shifted closer, lowering himself beside her, his hand resting gently against her side, waiting, listening, but the shallow rhythm that had once been there had faded into something softer, something distant, and yet her face remained calm, her expression no longer strained, her body no longer searching, as if whatever purpose had driven her through the cold and the dark had finally been fulfilled, and Ethan stayed there for a moment longer, not moving, not speaking, simply acknowledging the weight of what had just passed between them, a silent exchange that had required no words and left no room for doubt. And behind him one of the small forms stirred, a faint, uneven sound rising from the blanket as it shifted closer to its siblings, seeking warmth, seeking life, and Ethan turned his head slightly, his eyes resting on them as the firelight flickered gently across their fragile shapes, and something in his chest tightened, not from pain but from recognition, because he understood now, not just what she had done, but why she had chosen him, why she had refused to stop until she reached that door. It had not been about survival, not for herself, it had been about ensuring that something else would continue, something that could not speak, could not find its way alone, and Ethan let out a slow breath, his shoulders lowering as the realization settled fully into place, the cabin no longer feeling like a place of escape but something else entirely, something that held responsibility, connection, purpose, and as he reached for another blanket, pulling it gently over the small bodies to shield them from the cold that still lingered in the room, he understood that the silence he had lived in for so long had been broken not by noise, not by memory, but by something far more enduring, something that had crossed miles of frozen ground to remind him that Even in the quietest corners of the world, life still found a way to ask for one more chance. Morning did not arrive all at once, it came slowly, like a careful decision, the first pale light slipping through the frost-lined windows and stretching across the wooden floor until it reached the edge of the blanket where the small bodies lay gathered, their movements still fragile but steadier now, tiny shifts and soft sounds that carried a quiet persistence, and Ethan had not slept, not in the way he used to define it. Instead he had remained in the chair near the fire, watching, listening. Tending to the rhythm of something new, something that required him to stay present, to stay awake, and every now and then he would lean forward to adjust the blanket or check their warmth, his hands moving with a patience he had not practiced in years, the kind that did not rush, did not demand, but simply responded, and as the light grew stronger, he stood slowly, his body stiff from the long night, and crossed to the small kitchen counter where an old kettle rested, filling it with water and placing it over the stove, the quiet routine grounding him in a way that felt unfamiliar but steady, and behind him one of the puppies let out a faint sound, a thin, searching noise that drew his attention back instantly, and he turned, stepping closer, kneeling once more as he watched them shift closer together, instinct guiding them toward warmth and presence, and Ethan reached out, his fingers brushing gently against one of their small forms, feeling the faint pulse of life beneath its thin fur, and something inside him softened, not suddenly, not completely, but enough to change the way he held. That moment, and as he sat there, the memory came, not loud, not sharp, but quiet, like something that had been waiting for the right silence to return, a memory of a different time, of hands just as small, of a life he had once known but could not hold on to, and for a brief second his jaw tightened, his gaze lowering as the weight of that past brushed against him, but this time it did not pull him under. It simply existed beside what was in front of him, and he let out a slow breath, steadying himself, allowing both to remain without choosing one over the other, and behind him the kettle began to hum softly, the sound building in gentle layers, and Ethan rose, moving back to it, pouring the hot water into a chipped mug, the steam rising in slow curls that caught the morning light, and he stood there for a moment, holding it in both hands, feeling the warmth settle into his palms, grounding him again in the present, in the quiet work that still needed to be done, and when he turned back toward the room, his gaze moved briefly to the place where she rested, her body still, unchanged, yet no longer carrying the urgency of the night before, and Ethan nodded slightly, not in farewell, but in acknowledgement, as if understanding now that some journeys ended not with noise or struggle, but with a quiet completion that asked for nothing more, and he stepped forward again, setting the mug aside as he reached for another blanket, tucking it carefully around the small forms. Ensuring the warmth held, ensuring they had what they needed to continue, and as the light filled the cabin more fully, pushing back the shadows that had lingered through the night, Ethan realized that something had shifted, not in the world outside, not in the forest or the snow or the distant horizon, but in the space within him, a space that had once been closed, silent, untouched, now holding something fragile but real, something that required care, attention, and presence, and for the first time in a long while, the quiet around him did not feel like an escape, it felt like a place where something new could begin. The day unfolded slowly, not with urgency but with a quiet sequence of small tasks that anchored Ethan to the cabin in a way he had not felt in years, each movement carrying a purpose that extended beyond himself, and by mid-morning the light had settled fully across the room, warming the worn wood and softening the edges of everything it touched, including the fragile forms resting near the fire, their breathing more consistent now, their small bodies shifting occasionally as if testing the world they had been brought into, and Ethan found himself watching them more than anything else, noticing the subtle differences between them, the way one seemed slightly stronger, nudging forward with more intent, while another stayed tucked deeper into the folds of the blanket, conserving what little energy it had, and he adjusted his approach accordingly, moving closer when needed, ensuring the warmth held, adding small amounts of water using a cloth, careful not to rush, careful not to overwhelm, because instinct told him that survival here would not come from force, but from patience, from consistency, from staying present through each quiet moment that asked for attention, and as he worked, the cabin itself seemed to shift around him, no longer just a place he passed time in, but something that responded to what he was doing, the fire crackling a little steadier, the air holding a different kind of stillness, not empty but attentive, As if the space recognized that it was being used for something more than solitude, and every so often Ethan's gaze would drift toward the corner where she lay, his expression unreadable but steady, not avoiding, not lingering too long, simply acknowledging, and there was a kind of understanding there now, one that did not need explanation, because what had been given to him had already been received, and the weight of it did not feel heavy in the way he expected, it felt grounding, like something placed into his hands that required care rather than contemplation, and as the hours moved forward, he stepped outside. Briefly, gathering more firewood from the stack beside the cabin, the cold air biting sharper now under the midday light, the snow reflecting brightness that made the world feel wider than it had the night before, and for a moment he paused, looking out across the trees, the same forest that had hidden the path he had followed only hours ago, now standing still and silent as if nothing had ever happened within it, and yet he knew better, because the evidence of that night was inside, breathing, shifting, holding on, and Ethan turned back without hesitation, carrying the wood inside, closing the door firmly behind him as if sealing something in, or perhaps sealing something out, and when he returned to the blanket, one of the puppies had moved farther than before, inching slowly toward the edge of the warmth, its small body trembling but determined, and Ethan knelt immediately, guiding it gently back, his hand steady, his touch careful, and for a brief second the puppy stilled beneath his fingers, its movement calming, its breathing settling, and Ethan felt it again, that quiet recognition, that connection that did not rely on words or memory, only presence, only the willingness to remain, and he stayed there a moment longer than necessary, his hand resting lightly against the blanket as the fire flickered beside them, and something in him shifted again, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to make him realize that this was no longer something temporary, no longer something that would pass when the snow melted or the forest returned to its usual silence. This had become part of his life now, woven into the space he occupied, into the routine he had once kept empty on purpose, and as he leaned back slightly, watching the small rise and fall of fragile breaths in the quiet cabin, Ethan understood that sometimes the smallest lives carried the greatest weight, not because of what they demanded, but because of what they quietly asked a person to become. By late afternoon the light began to change again, stretching longer across the cabin floor and softening into a quiet gold that made everything feel slower, more deliberate, and Ethan noticed the difference not in the sky but in the rhythm inside the room, the puppies moving more than before, their small bodies shifting with slightly stronger intent, their faint sounds no longer as fragile as they had been that morning, and he adjusted his place beside them, sitting closer now, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the blanket as if his presence alone could steady whatever uncertainty remained, and every so often one of them would nudge blindly toward his warmth, pressing against his fingers before settling again, and he did not pull away, he stayed, letting that quiet contact exist without interruption, because he understood now that what they needed was not just heat or shelter, but something steadier, something consistent that did not disappear when the room grew quiet, and as the fire shifted behind him, sending a soft crack through the air, his gaze drifted once more to the still form in the corner, and for the first time since morning he stood and walked toward her fully, not just glancing, not just acknowledging from a distance, but stepping into that space with intention, his boots slow against the wood, his posture steady as he knelt beside her, the light from the window catching along the edges of her fur, now free of the frost that had clung to it the night before, and he reached out again, his hand resting gently against her side, not searching this time, not checking, simply present, and he stayed there for a moment, longer than before, letting the silence speak in the way it sometimes did when words had no place, and in that stillness he felt something settle inside him, not closure, not exactly, but acceptance, a quiet understanding that some journeys ended without asking for recognition, without needing anything in return, and yet still managed to change everything they touched, and Ethan lowered his gaze slightly, his expression calm but heavy with thought, before he reached for the old wool blanket folded nearby, lifting it carefully and placing it over her, tucking it around her form with a slow, deliberate care that carried more meaning than any gesture he had made in years. And when he finished he sat back on his heels for a brief moment, the room holding a kind of reverence that did not feel forced, only earned, and then, just as quietly as he had come, he stood and returned to the fire, to the small lives waiting there, because that was where his place was now, not in the stillness of what had ended, but in the fragile movement of what remained, and as the evening settled in, bringing with it a deeper calm. Ethan found himself moving through the cabin with a different awareness, adding wood to the fire before it burned too low, checking the blankets before the temperature dropped, adjusting the space around them so that nothing disturbed the steady warmth he had built. And each action carried a quiet intention, not rushed, not uncertain, but grounded in something that felt unfamiliar and yet deeply right. And as he sat down once more beside the blanket, the light from the fire reflecting softly in his eyes, he realized that the silence he had once depended on had changed shape. It no longer pushed the world away, it held it gently, creating space for something to grow within it. And as one of the puppies shifted closer again, pressing lightly against his hand, Ethan did not move, he simply remained there, steady and present, understanding now that sometimes the most important things in life did not arrive with noise or warning, they arrived quietly, asking only for someone willing to stay. The night settled deeper than the one before, not with the same tension or uncertainty, but with a quiet sense of continuation, as if the cabin itself had accepted the change that had taken place within its walls, and Ethan moved through it with a steadiness that no longer felt unfamiliar, adding another log to the fire before it dimmed, adjusting the blanket once more as the temperature outside dropped, the cold pressing gently against the windows in soft, silent waves, and the small forms near the hearth responded in kind, their movements no longer as fragile, their breathing more certain, each subtle shift carrying the quiet proof that they had crossed through the most uncertain hours and found something steady on the other side. And Ethan sat beside them again, his back resting lightly against the old chair, his gaze lowered not in distance but in focus, watching the rise and fall of their tiny bodies as if each breath mattered in a way that reshaped time itself, slowing it, grounding it. And as the firelight flickered across the room, his thoughts drifted not backward as they once had, but forward in small, measured ways, considering what would be needed in the coming days, more warmth, more care, perhaps a longer trip into town for supplies, things he had not thought about in months because they had not been necessary, and yet now they felt natural, like steps already forming beneath his feet before he had even decided to take them. And he reached down again, his hand resting gently along the edge of the blanket, feeling the faint warmth gather beneath his palm, a quiet exchange of presence that did not require acknowledgement, only consistency. And for a moment the cabin held a stillness so complete it felt almost sacred, the kind of silence that did not empty a space but filled it with something unseen yet undeniable. And it was in that stillness that Ethan noticed something else, something subtle but distinct. One of the puppies had shifted farther than before, its small body moving with a new kind of intention, inching away from the center before pausing, its head lifting just slightly as if sensing something beyond the warmth it had known. And Ethan leaned forward, not intervening immediately, allowing the movement to unfold, and the puppy let out a faint sound, softer than a cry, more like a question, before settling again, its body easing back toward the others. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound carrying a quiet understanding, because he recognized that motion, not from memory but from instinct, the first sign of something beginning to reach outward, to explore, to exist beyond the place it had been brought into. And he sat back again, his posture relaxed but attentive, knowing that what had started here would not remain contained, it would grow, change, move forward in ways he could not fully control. And for the first time in a long while that thought did not unsettle him, it grounded him, gave shape to something he had avoided, something that required not just presence but commitment. And as the fire settled into a steady glow and the night deepened around the cabin, Ethan remained where he was, not because he had to, but because he chose to, his place. No longer defined by distance from the world, but by the quiet responsibility that had found him. And as one of the puppies pressed lightly against his hand once more, seeking warmth without hesitation, he did not move away, he stayed, understanding now that sometimes the smallest lives carried forward the greatest purpose, not by asking loudly, but by trusting someone to remain when it mattered most. The following morning arrived with a quiet clarity that felt different from the days before, the light stretching across the cabin not just as a passage of time but as a gentle confirmation that something had taken root and chosen to remain. And Ethan stepped outside briefly, the cold air sharp against his face as he paused on the porch, looking out across the snow-covered trees that stood still and endless, their branches holding the memory of the night that had changed everything. And for a moment he simply stood there, breathing slowly, the silence no longer pressing against him but resting beside him, steady and present. And when he turned back inside, the warmth of the cabin greeted him in a way it never had before, not as a retreat but as something alive, something that held purpose within its walls, and he moved toward the fire without hesitation, his step certain, his gaze already searching for the small shapes near the blanket, and they were there, closer together than before, their movements subtle but stronger, each breath carrying a quiet determination that did not need to be spoken, and Ethan knelt beside them once more, his hand resting gently along the edge of the wool as he watched them shift and settle, their fragile lives continuing forward in small, steady increments, and he felt it then, not as a sudden realization but as something that had been building through every moment since the night before, a sense that what had begun here was not meant to end, not when the snow melted, not when the forest returned to its usual rhythm, but something that would carry forward into the days ahead, shaping them in ways he could not yet fully see, and he reached for a small wooden crate from the corner, placing it nearby and lining it carefully with softer cloth, adjusting the space so that it held warmth more securely, his movements thoughtful and deliberate, each action guided by something deeper than habit, something that understood the importance of what was being protected, and as he worked, one of the puppies shifted again, its small body pressing forward with a little more strength than before, its head lifting just slightly before settling again, and Ethan watched it closely, a faint, almost unnoticeable change in his expression softening the edges of his usual stillness, and he stayed there a moment longer, his hands steady, his presence unwavering, because he understood now that what they needed most was not perfection, not certainty, but consistency, the quiet promise that someone would remain through each uncertain step, and as the day continued to unfold around them, the cabin filled with a different kind of silence, one that did not isolate but connected, holding each small sound, each movement, each breath as part of something larger than any single moment, and Ethan sat back slightly, his gaze moving briefly toward the covered form in the corner before returning to the small lives beside him, the weight of that connection settling into place without conflict, without resistance, because both belonged here now, the ending and the beginning, the stillness and the movement, each part of the same quiet story that had found its way to his door. And as the fire crackled softly and the light shifted across the floor, Ethan remained where he was, not out of obligation, but out of understanding, knowing that sometimes the greatest changes did not come from what a person searched for, but from what arrived unannounced, asking only for a place to continue, and in that simple, steady presence, he found something he had not known he was missing, not something loud or overwhelming, but something quiet, something enduring, something that stayed.